I aim to show here that in his tradition, the relationship between a sentient being and a Buddha might be better reflected by how a sentient being exists within the Buddha rather than how a Buddha or Buddha nature exists within sentient beings. So I'm revisiting a lot of the material that I presented before in my first book, and also a lot of the material that we've seen here. Mipam was a late figure, and he's synthesizing a lot of different traditions. But I wanted to flip the metaphor, kind of describe a new iteration with Shinpin Hukum is here too, her book, The Buddha Within, but flip it to the sentient beings within Buddha rather than the Buddha within sentient beings. And before I go further, I wanted to draw this parallel with emptiness and Buddha nature. We've seen, like Ngok Lotsawa and in Tsoknyi Gatso that Filippo presented, based on a Gelug tradition, in particular, Kedrupje describes Buddha nature as the absence of intrinsic nature of the mind. We could think of that as a quality, emptiness as a quality. And emptiness can also be thought of as a substance, like as a ground, the empty ground. And often other emptiness is criticized by being kind of a metaphysical realism or something that's non-Buddhist, like crypto-Atman. Sometimes it's also described emptiness endowed with all supreme aspects. So with all the Buddha qualities embedded in it. And so like was mentioned in the, I think, Ratnagata Vibhaga 128, I believe, that the classic Shindong verse of that the element is not empty of all the qualities of the Buddha. But I think we should be careful when we throw around the term Shindong or other emptiness, other empty, because it has a lot of different meanings in different traditions. And Matthew Kapstein, a classic article, "We Are All Shindongbas," encouraged us to pay particular attention to particulars when, how, and in what context Shindong is used, because even a Gelug interpretation, the nirvana is empty of samsara, so it's not necessarily that other emptiness is something that's so straightforward and self-disclosing. So in any case, so emptiness sometimes is a lack of intrinsic nature, lack of svabhava, sometimes is a basis, and then also is inconceivable. This nam chong mayimbe tantam or trutrel, non-conceptual, beyond any quality substrate relationship, something beyond the mind. And in parallel with this, because in the Mipam describes Buddha nature as emptiness, but so does the Gelug tradition, so does the Jonon tradition we saw, in the sense that it's other empty. In parallel here we have Buddha nature as a cause, like the cause or potential to become a Buddha. And with Ngok Lotsawa, it's the, what is observed based on which, that you become a Buddha based on observing that absence. And for the Gelug tradition as well, this megak, this non-affirming or non-implicative negation. But it's also the fruition, all the Buddhist qualities, right? So the 10 powers and the 4 fearlessnesses, the 18 unshared qualities, and so on. And it's also a unity, kind of this collapse of this duality of cause and fruition, or a collapse of the duality of sentient being and Buddha. So as with all kind of typologies, they sometimes obscure as much as they disclose, so don't hold on too much to this, but I wanted to kind of present this first to frame some of these quotations. I'm going to just basically show several quotations from different sources of Mipam's works and think about the different meanings that he presents. And many of the citations are coming from his Lion's Roar exposition of Buddha nature. So that's, I have a translation of that in my first book, and he presents like different interpretations of Buddha nature and distinguishes his view from it. So namely, like the non-implicative negation or megak. He says it's not just an absence, which Kedrupje and the Gelug tradition take on, and it's not like a permanent, unchanging thing that is often associated with Shindong or other emptiness interpretations, particularly the Jonang. And it's also not simply the unity of awareness and clarity, or Selrik Sungjuk, in the sense when Rik or Rikpa is not distinguished from Sem or mind. So he makes this important distinction that we saw also between Namshe and Yeshe, or Sem and Rikpa, kind of like ordinary mind and gnosis or wisdom. So that also the Sakya tradition, we see this in like Gorampa, and so he's really distinguishing and his unique interpretation from different other sectarian traditions, and charting out his own unique Nyingma interpretation, inspired by Longchenpa. David Higgins has written on this. Costanza, also a graduate student writing on Longchenpa's interpretation of Buddha nature, and also Dorje Wangchuk is also here and has written on this topic. Just one more before I start to show some of these quotes. Another reason why we have to be careful about the interpretation of Shindong is because even for Gelugpas, emptiness is permanent. So the ultimate is permanent and unchanging. So if we just flip the language with the terminology that's often associated with Shindong, permanent, eternal, unchanging, it's not that different when you look at the ultimate truth in the Gelug tradition. So some of my work that extending from this, now I'm very interested in looking at this tradition that goes beyond Rongdong and Shindong to this kind of unity, and that's also compatible with certain Gelug interpretations like we saw with Tsogni Ganso, and particularly with the Nyingma. But that is a future paper, so I will begin. This also comes from the Lion's Roar, the Donton Singing Aro. Mipam also wrote another Lion's Roar, the Affirmation of Other Emptiness, that was translated, John Pettit in his book, and Matthew Kapstein, where he also says other emptiness is basically a conventional truth, just like emptiness is a conventional truth for the Gelugpas. The Buddha conventionally exists. There is nothing more, nothing that ultimately exists. But I'm not concerned with that text. This one, the Buddha nature, where he just says, the essence of the Buddha nature itself is free from all conceptual constructs, such as existence and non-existence, permanence and annihilation. It is the equality of the single sphere of indivisible truth. So he's presenting this kind of third, it's non-conceptual, it's beyond these categories, but at the same time, he's kind of asserting this indivisibility, this unity. So we see this back and forth with him with this, what I've described as a dialectic of presence and absence. So he describes Buddha nature here as free from all conceptual constructs in the same language he uses to describe emptiness. Buddha nature, like emptiness, is the basic nature of all phenomena. let me go back, sorry. That's bad, right? Whoops, sorry. So he also explains not just this language of, that's going forwards, right? Okay. This is backwards. I'm sorry. I'll just leave it there because I don't want you to be distracted by that, what I'm not going to read. So he uses this language of, this affirmative language of indivisible truth, a great unconditioned, and Don Lopez mentioned this, Gemello's article on the cataphatic and apophatic language in drawing from like theological traditions and Buddha nature. And I very much think that Buddha nature is very much rooted in, if we think of these issues of theological questions, can be very helpful in kind of thinking about Buddha nature, because these issues extend to the nature of God in Abrahamic traditions, as well as you see this in India with the relationship between Brahman and Maya in the Vedantin tradition, as well as in the Samkhya tradition as well, between the Purusha, or the pure spirit, and Prakriti, and how this, how things got started, or are things a real transformation or just an expression of some ultimate. So this positive language, Mipam describes, I'm quoting him, I didn't have it on the PowerPoint. So wisdom such as this is the great unconditioned, which does not abide in either extreme of being conditioned or unconditioned. So he draws this dichotomy between like permanence and impermanence, that it's not one of those, it's this great permanence or the great unconditioned. Since entities and non-entities are phenomena and are dependent arisings or dependent imputations, when authentically analyzed, they are hollow, fake, lies, and deception. Buddha nature is the great unconditioned, the basic nature of all phenomena that are entities or non-entities, which is authentically non-deceptive. So that ends his quote. So he explains that partial cognitions or limited cognitions, like namshe consciousness, are necessarily impermanent. Wisdom, however, is beyond this dichotomy of being impermanent or permanent. But he also qualifies wisdom as permanent. He states that from the perspective of sentient beings, ordinary conventional sources of knowledge, or ordinary conventional pramanas, exclusively observe functional and thus impermanent entities. However, in the perspective of wisdom, omniscience is permanent. And then I'll quote him again. So if I can get back. So this is, somehow these quotes got out of order. So I'm going to read the quote I have and then I'll come to this one. So in accord with the mental perspectives of others, those to be trained who have not been transformed, the scriptures say that omniscience is impermanent. And then he cites the Pramanavartika, Dharmakirti, saying that a source of knowledge, a pramana, is impermanent. But then he continues to say this is necessary and necessarily established as such for perspectives of non-Buddhist heretics and those of common vehicles who have not trained their minds in the manner of transformation. So he's saying that this is just for the purpose of teaching others, for refuting other positions. They have no method whatsoever for the arising of what is other than the manner of appearance from the perspective of consciousness. And then he says, however, as for the vision of the thoroughly transformed wisdom, omniscience is established as permanent. So and that's quoting him, ending that quote. So functional entities, ngobo, are necessarily impermanent phenomena, a claim made within Dharmakirti's epistemological tradition, where there's this dichotomy of functional entities and permanent non-entities. But Mipam contextualizes these statements regarding wisdom as impermanent and says it's just for the purpose of others. And those who haven't fully understood the meaning. So he delimits the necessity of cognition being impermanent to only the perspective of consciousness, or namshe, not the perspective of wisdom, or yeshe. So here we see this ye again, like we saw in Khenpo's presentation of Jigten Sumgun. Thus he makes an epistemological distinction between appearance and reality based on consciousness and wisdom respectively. Wisdom is unchanging. Only in the perspective of consciousness is there an apparent change. So this is this appearance-reality distinction that's so central for him. Mipam states that there is no arising or ceasing of dualistic phenomena in the basic nature that abides without ever changing. He adds that this basic nature can be called permanent because it exists and is not momentary. So something that exists and is not momentary can be called permanent. And then to quote him again from the lion's roar, to an untransformed one who has dualistic perception, there is the inconvertible and undeniable appearances of inequality, all the changing adventitious defilements suitable to be removed, occurring sequentially as arising and ceasing moments, samsara and nirvana, good and bad, and so on. However, the basic nature, or the chunyi, suchness, abides as the great equality in which arising, ceasing, and dualistic phenomena are not established. All spatial aspects and temporal changes are incorporated in that state. This exists as the domain of a sublime being, an Arya's individual reflexive awareness wisdom. And there is no pollution by the changes of the three times. So why not give this the name, great permanence? It is designated as such because it exists and it does not arise momentarily. So Mipam affirms that this basic nature or Buddha nature exists and it does not arise and cease momentarily. And so it can be called permanent by definition of what it means to be permanent. But he denies emphatically that this is an entity. This basic nature is immobile. He states that when the basic nature is evaluated from its own side, the rangune, it is neither observed as a conditioned entity nor an unconditioned non-entity. And he explains this in his Vajra Essence, Dorje Nyingpo, which is one of the texts from his Nyuksim Korsum, which is a trilogy based explicitly on Dzogchen, one of the few places where he's explicitly dealing with topics of Dzogchen or the Great Perfection. So when evaluated in terms of the basic nature from its own side, it is observed as neither of the two, or conditioned or unconditioned entity or non-entity. Because the basic nature, not abiding in the extremes of either the conditioned or the unconditioned, is known through individual reflexive awareness. So we see this across his text on Great Perfection and in his more kind of sutra mode. And as we see with Kagyu and Nyingma, there's a lot of, and Jonang as well, fluidity between sutras and tantras, where Sakya and Gelug tend to keep these very separate categories. But I see, Mipam's writing on Buddha nature in particular is kind of infused by this, the background is the Great Perfection or Dzogchen, and he's shaping his views on emptiness and Buddha nature through this lens. So he states that the basic nature from its own side is neither conditioned nor unconditioned. However, in terms of the way things appear, it is posited as newly arisen from the aspect of being a freed effect, a dreldre. So Khenpo mentioned today like two types of causes, causes that are that cause something, that bring something out, or something that kind of accommodates something. Likewise, there's the effects that are maturations or real transformation, and effects that are just removing what was obscuring what was already there. It is also posited as conditioned from the aspect, the basic nature of the progressive engagement in enlightened activity for beings to be trained. In this way, Mipam distinguishes the mode of reality, or Neitsul, where all is inseparable from the great equality, from the mode of appearance, or Nangsul, where everything appears distinctly. Furthermore, he cites again this Vajra Essence, this text from the Nyuksim Korsum, the Trilogy of Innate Mind, where he says, most others assert that the essence of the exalted body and wisdom, the gu and yeshe of a Buddha, is impermanent and that it is a permanent continuity. Those who accept the intrinsic nature of the fruitional emptiness that is endowed with all supreme aspects of the exalted body and wisdom assert as follows. The own essence of the exalted body and wisdom is permanent, but in the mode of appearance of those to be trained, it is impermanent continuity. So in distinction to the way others have asserted wisdom is impermanent, and Klaus mentioned Shakya Chokden, who accepts this position, Mipam affirms the view that the essence of wisdom is permanent. He argues that according to the mode of reality, the Neitsul, nothing ever wavers from the non-arising and unceasing equality. Nevertheless, everything appears distinctly and unmixed according to the mode of appearance. He shows that these two perspectives need not be in conflict, such that if holding one position according to the mode of reality as it is, one must reject the mode of appearance, and vice versa. He shows that both views, the view of the ultimate mode of reality and the conventional mode of appearance, can be held in their respective contexts, and adds that understanding the meaning of the non-contradiction of the two truths is a key point in understanding the viewpoint of sutras and tantras. Thus, all beings have or are Buddha nature. It is only in the perspective of seeming reality that the world appears otherwise. So this is this inversion of that metaphor that sentient beings are just a distortion within Buddha nature, which is actually the way things are. Furthermore, he states that in both cases of sutra and mantra, or in tantra, in terms of the conventional way of appearance, a distinction can be made between the way reality is, where appearance and existence are primordially the Buddha, and the way things appear conventionally, where wisdom appears as a new development. And this, Lodro Noma, this is another text from this trilogy of the innate mind, Nyuksum Korsum, where he says, although in terms of the ultimate mode of reality, appearance and existence are asserted to be primordially Buddha, and one should meditate as such, in terms of the conventional way of appearance, insight can make a distinction, can make a distinction of three: the ground, the heritage, or gotra, rik, which is the potential to be a Buddha, the path, which is the occasion of practice, and the fruition, which is the consummation of purity. This is accepted all the way up to the great perfection. So he affirms these three contexts of the ground, path, and fruition. And in the context of meditation, however, he advocates meditation done in accordance with the mode of reality, in which everything is primordially the Buddha. Thus, rather than Buddha nature being within sentient beings, once again, Buddha nature is the way things are. Sentient beings are appearance within Buddha nature, and a distorted appearance at that. Don, in the keynote speech, also mentioned the Obermiller using the term pantheism, and I've also been, using that term as well to describe certain aspects of Vajrayana and Nyingma interpretation of Buddha nature, because I think this term can help kind of gain a different perspective, shed different light on how things are seen in this tradition. So Mipam further explains these three contexts in terms of consciousness and wisdom. In terms of the mode of appearance, the Nongsul, he delineates three contexts. So the impure, which is the function of consciousness only, the impure and pure mixed, which is a mix of consciousness and wisdom, or the Namshe and Yeshe, and the extremely pure, which is a function of only wisdom. And we see these three contexts also in the Ratnagota Vibhaga of impurity, slight purity, and extreme purity. So again, from this Lodro Nangma, from the trilogy of the innate mind, Nyuksum Korsum, he says, although from the beginning there are no obscurations in the essence of the expanse of the basic nature, since the ground and fruition are established as indivisible, the mode of reality is ascertained as the viewpoint of the primordial Buddha. And in the mode of appearance, when perfecting the strength of meditation, one also becomes a Buddha again through actualizing the concordant modes of appearance and reality. So once again, he makes distinctions in terms of the way things appear, but at the time of meditating on the nature of reality, he advocates that it's done so in accord with reality when all things are equal. Another, just from the same text, so in terms of the mode of appearance, since one asserts the ground as natural purity and the fruition as qualified by the purity that is freed from the adventitious defilements, it is not that there are no distinctions. So this is also a distinction we see with the Rangchen Nerik and the Gegurbe Rik, the nature, the Gotra that is the natural purity and the development that is develops to be free from these adventitious defilements. Nevertheless, when conclusively settling, or lato esse, one should ascertain in accord with the mode of reality, because if one does not, samsara itself will not be realized as nirvana, even though when making distinction, one accords with the mode of appearance. By that, the equality of samsara and nirvana within the mode of reality is not negated, because there is no impurity within the mode of reality. So in this way, he delineates two contexts in terms of the mode of reality, where there are no distinctions, and in terms of the mode of appearance, where appearances arise as unmixed and distinctions are made. While there are no distinctions within the ultimate mode of reality known by wisdom, insight makes distinction between what is true and not true conventionally. He delineates what exists and what does not exist from the perspective of a conventional source of knowledge, conventional pramanas, even though there are no distinctions between Buddhas and sentient beings in the mode of reality. The mode of appearance is such that sentient beings can exist as distinct from Buddhas. Through delineating appearance and reality in this way, he aims to affirm the primordial endowment of the qualities of the Buddha in sentient beings without incurring the consequence that all sentient beings must necessarily appear as Buddhas. So, looking at the time, I think I have a little bit. Okay. So a topic closely associated with Buddha nature is heritage, this Rik or Gotra. Heritage is the potential to be a Buddha at the time of a sentient being. And Mipam identifies heritage with the essential nature, Nyingpo, saying that heritage is the basic nature of mind that abides in the manner of an extract or essential core enclosed by adventitious defilements. He characterizes the heritage as the basic nature of mind that is not actualized or not manifest. In his Vajra essence, again, this text from the Trilogy of Innate Mind, Mipam also calls the basic nature of mind Buddha nature. And he says, I'll quote him, existing in the minds of all sentient beings in the manner of the basic nature, on the occasion when obscurations dwell as suitable to be removed, it is called Buddha nature, because when this basic nature of mind is realized, one becomes a Buddha. So when the presently existing basic nature of mind is realized, one becomes a Buddha. Thus, the Buddha nature is not within sentient beings. Rather, Buddha nature is the nature of sentient beings when their nature is seen as it is. Thus, the distortion of the world as a sentient being can be said to exist within the reality that is Buddha nature, this self-existing wisdom. And Mipam emphasizes that the self-existing wisdom is simply made manifest. It is not produced by a cause. He says that even though the Dharmakaya appears to be a new production, it is in fact a freed effect when the obscuring conditions are removed. And going back to this text, self-existing wisdom is not produced by a cause because actually the truth body, or the Dharmakaya, freed from the adventitious defilements, is a freed effect. Although it appears to be newly produced by a cause, it merely appears as such in the way of appearance for those who are untransformed. However, in the terms of the actual meaning, in the essence of the Dharmakaya, truth body, which is the basic nature without arising or disintegration, from the beginning, all phenomena are as equality, the actual Buddha, primordially nirvana, naturally luminous and clear, and so on. So he states that the new development of the Dharmakaya is only the way of appearance for those who are untransformed, and that all phenomena are actually primordially the Buddha. In the intelligent presence, the Ludranama, Mipam states that the qualities of a Buddha at the time of the ground, or at the time of the sentient being, are merely a potential to exist as manifest. And he describes this two types of potential, the potential to transform into a newly produced Buddha and the potential of what is already present to manifest. So in his presentation of the way Buddha nature exists for a sentient being, he rejects the former, the transformation model, and accepts the latter, or the manifestation. He states that the primordial qualities of wisdom are already present. They are an intrinsic endowment, like a knife has the ability to cut, a mirror to reflect, and a gemstone to shine when they are not kind of obscured, when the knife is not in the sheath and the gemstone is not in the mud. All right, I have a section on how he draws from Longchenpa, but I'm going to skip that in light of time. And let me jump to these last quotes. So Mipam refers to the Buddha nature as the mode of reality of the ground of the primeval beginning, the Ye Toki Shi. Yeah, I have 20. I set the stopwatch for. Oh, is it? Because I think I started late. Because I started a little bit. But I'll wrap it up. I just do want to hit a few quotes. So Buddha nature is not a mere absence. It is emptiness and luminous clarity. It is the mode of reality of the ground of the primeval beginning of all phenomenon. The mode of reality is indivisible truth of unity. Emptiness endowed with all supreme aspects. And then, so we've seen this language of the ground. He also says, and this is getting to the influence of the great perfection. So this ground itself, from the aspects of lacking any constructs, is primordially pure. Unlike mere space like emptiness, it is self-illuminating. So this is this unity quality, not a mere absence, not a real presence either, but this unity. Without bias, confinement, or partiality, spontaneously present. As the source of all appearances of samsara and nirvana, it is said to be all-pervasive, compassionate resonance. So this tukche gunkep, which is also coming from this great perfection language. In the language of the great perfection, it is called the ground abiding wisdom with the three endowments. So these three endowments are this empty essence, natural clarity, and all-pervasive compassionate resonance. This ngol domba rangshan sewa tuche gunkep. So Mipam affirms that all beings, without difference, are endowed with Buddha nature from the beginning. He makes an important distinction in his presentation between the way things appear and the way things are. In claiming that the qualities of the Buddha are the nature of reality, his position reflects an affirmation of other emptiness, or shindong. Nevertheless, the fact that he also describes Buddha nature as empty of its own essence distinguishes his position from this one. Rather than describing Buddha nature as something that exists within sentient beings, to claim that sentient beings are a distortion that occurs within Buddha nature perhaps better represents the role that Buddha nature plays in this tradition. Indeed, the way Mipam describes Buddha nature as a primordial unity of emptiness and appearance reflects his legacy of the great perfection, the unified ground and fruition. So just some conclusions to draw. So there's several meanings of Buddha nature. When I was laying in bed, jet lag last night, I was thinking of, we were talking about Wittgenstein over dinner, and this duck rabbit, the famous, you look at it one way, it's a duck, you look at it another way, it's a rabbit, but it's the duck rabbit. And I think this sheds light on how, channeling Wittgenstein, the Mipam, bringing these together, this Rongdong and Shendong, but it's also something different. So it has different meanings. Buddha nature is inconceivable, and thus its faith comes to play a role. Also in the Ratnagotari Bhaga, right, the self-existing is known by faith alone. It says, like the blind, don't see the sun. Buddha nature functions to overcome this duality. Dualities that are embedded within, a real Buddha, unreal samsara, that are even embedded within other emptiness or shindo. So it's just overcoming nirvana, samsara, Buddha, sentient being dualities. And thus, since Buddha nature is the way things are, I wanted to play with inverting this metaphor that so sentient beings are within Buddha nature. Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes for questions.
Is it correct that I understand that with that Dzogchen background, the ground is identical here, according to Mipam, with the Geshe Ningpo?
Well, David Higgins has done some work on this in terms of Longchenpa. There's different times when the ground is described as like neither samsara nor nirvana, like this chishi, or this kind of general ground, undifferentiated. And sometimes it's described as this kind of positive, a positive ground. Yeah, that is something unique, I think, to, I could be wrong, but to Dzogchen, great perfection, that it's not shared with Mahamudra. Because I saw a lot of parallels in here with what Gampopa and even Jigten Sumgun and the Drikung Kagyu were presenting. But this undifferentiated, kind of neither Shijik Lamni, like this single ground, but two ways to interpret it. But sometimes it is identified with Buddha nature. So I think it's, what I do think is distinctive about Dzogchen and Mahamudra is the, like it's it's, what's the word, allergic to systematization to an extent. So it actually kind of, any type of kind of, oh, this is the view, then it's kind of, that's a problem. So any type of, holding on to some type of, well, this is the clearly other emptiness, or this is clearly the lack of intrinsic nature. So any type of really clear systematization. So I think that's part of this, like the duck-rabbit analogy, like to say, is it a duck, is it a rabbit, or is it a duck-rabbit? So all of it, yes, it's all of it, but it's also none of it.
And with this she,
Mm-hmm.
in the Buddhist Dzogchen context, would you equalize it with the Kunchi concept of the bun?
Kunchi concept of the bun. I'm not so familiar with the Kunchi concept of the bun. I know there is a lot of shared material with Dzogchen, and as well shared kind of theorizing that Bun later borrowed from the Buddhist in terms of theorizing about emptiness as well. So yeah, so I can't answer that question. So I won't.
Well, your phrase "sentient" being within, is quite interesting because, like in one of my PhD seminars, we have this kind of interdisciplinary ones. There was somebody from the Oriental Institute and gave a talk about Sufi approach, to Islam. And so I asked him, well, does the practitioner then become identical with Allah? I said, no, that's impossible. But you will be in Allah, you will be
Right,
Allah.
right.
So, and then I said, well, this is very difficult to understand from a Buddhist point of view. But what you are presenting, seems to be exactly that. Can you elaborate on that?
Right, yeah. So sometimes theological traditions will make a distinction between pantheism, where this is full identity of God and world, and panentheism, adding the "in" to all is in God. But I think some of these arguments, I wrote an article on pantheism, Buddha nature and pantheism, but looking at the arguments from the Ratnagotravibhaga that because the Buddha body is is luminous, and because suchness is undifferentiated, and because all beings have gotra, then all beings have the nature of Buddha. But using each of those three arguments, pairing them with arguments for God, like in Abrahamic traditions, like ontological argument, cosmological argument, and teleological argument, basically based on cause, essence, and effect. But it's interesting that Ngok Lodsawa also uses those three. He describes them as cause, essence, and effect, and those are the three main arguments for God in theological Abrahamic traditions. So I think there are a lot of parallels, but I guess this, the creation ex nihilo, the creation out of nothing, which apparently wasn't always, an Abrahamic tradition anyway. It was kind of a later development, but it became orthodoxy. And this kind of radical distinction between God and world, this ontological gulf, which is also not ubiquitous, and it's also there are derivations within those traditions, but I think that also creates kind of the difference, what's unique about Buddhist traditions. But I think there's a lot shared. I think there's a lot to be learned from the conversation, outside, in between Buddhist traditions, but also, going beyond them to other traditions as well.
Is Buddha nature also consciousness? Is Buddha nature consciousness?
Well, not as within that distinction between consciousness and wisdom. So the Namshe Yeshe. So that's one of the
Wisdom, right?
yes, wisdom. So that's one of the ways he distinguishes the view from someone who would just say that it's the unity of consciousness and emptiness.
So all sentient beings are actually within the wisdom. Am I correct?
Well, it's primordial, so it's always there. It can't be. I think that's the problem. If it's created, it's conditioned, right? So if it's a new production, then it means it's impermanent. So it has to be, for something to be unconditioned, it can't be created or produced, and so it's got to be there to have a coherent picture. So yes.
I just have one kind of technical thing about this phrase. I saw it come up twice in your translations, and you had it in your chart too. This Nampa Kunchok Dengi Tampani.
Mm.
And I'm wondering, within your reading of this Nyupsam Kursam, but even more broadly in Mipam's writings, does he use this?
He uses it, yes, yeah.
Because it seems to me, it's used all over the college chakra.
Right, right.
So, and I don't know where it comes from. I haven't done that kind of hunt. But it's very curious to see that in discussions on Buddha nature and so on and so forth. Right?
Right. Well, it's this unity. I mean, it's the unity of the Buddhist qualities and emptiness. So it is. I mean, that's one aspect of the Namba Chokden, the kind of supreme aspects, and then emptiness. So these are they're not different.
Yeah, they describe emptiness as having these kind of, as you say, supreme aspects.
Right.
It's not that they're different.
Right.
That's how emptiness is described.
Right.
Is that how he uses
Yeah.
it?
So it's not different. So it's this unity. They're not different. Yeah. So they're inseparable. So they're inseparable. Yeah.
Huh. That's interesting. And he uses that throughout.
He uses that. Yeah. He uses that. In one of the
Plug it in.
in one of the texts in that trilogy, he distinguishes Kalachakra Dzogchen from Dzogchen and visions, and then says that this is better.
Oh, that's interesting. Where's
That
that?
Dzogchen, it's in the second of the trilogy.
Okay. Thanks.
In fact, also, as I was showing this morning, it's in Indian, so we use this term, and I think it's true in German literature. at
In
least.
German
This
literature, it's all over the
definitely
place.
comes from Kalachakra.
Yeah. Yeah. But to see in the Dzogchen context used regularly is interesting.
I think we can stop here.
Okay, thank you.